Lieutenant Robert Hawk Delaney of the 354th Fighter Group had flown countless escort and interdiction missions since arriving in the European theater. Yet nothing in his training, his combat experience, or the many dangers he had survived could have prepared him for the moment when he glanced down at his instrument panel and realized the harsh truth. His P-51 Mustang, serial 43122288, was running on fumes. The fuel gauge needle sagging lifelessly at the bottom of its arc, the reserve tank long exhausted, and the Merlin engine beginning to tremble in ways that only a combat pilot would recognize as the final warning before silence. Above the patchwork fields, hedgerows and villages of the Cotentin Peninsula, the sky was deceptively calm, a kind of blue that seemed almost indifferent to the chaos below as Allied divisions fought to expand the Normandy beachhead. But Robert Delaney was alone, separated from his wingman after an extended pursuit of a German reconnaissance aircraft dragged them far from their intended patrol zone. His wingman, Lieutenant Mark Tiller Thompson, had turned back early after taking a hit that knocked out his cooling system, leaving Delaney to continue the mission solo. He expected to return to base shortly, perhaps gliding part of the way if his engine quit early. But as he surveyed the terrain below and mentally calculated his dwindling options, a faint glint on the horizon caught his eye, initially nothing more than a flicker of metal against the hazy morning light. The flicker grew into several shapes, and those shapes quickly resolved into unmistakable silhouettes. 9 Junkers Ju-88 bombers in tight formation, heading directly for Allied positions near Utah Beach, escorted by 4 Bf-109 G6 fighters positioned just above and behind the formation, their angular wings and long nose profiles cutting through the sky like sharpened blades. For a moment, Delaney simply stared, unable to ignore the brutal fact that he alone, nearly out of fuel, with no reinforcements visible, was the only Allied fighter standing between that strike force and thousands of troops, engineers, medics, artillerymen, and supply vehicles desperately working to consolidate the landing zones. A rational pilot would have disengaged. A rational pilot would have accepted that a powerless Mustang could not stop 13 armed German aircraft. But Robert Delaney was not wired for retreat. Every briefing he'd ever attended emphasized the dire consequences of letting even a handful of bombers reach the beaches. Every pilot who had flown over Normandy knew the skis were thinly defended during the early days of the invasion, with resources stretched to breaking. And every pilot understood the stakes. If those Ju-88s unleashed their payloads on the beachhead, the cost in lives would be catastrophic, perhaps even altering the momentum of the invasion itself. So Delaney tightened his grip on the stick, steadied his breathing, and banked his P-51 toward the approaching formation, making the decision that would define not only his career, but also one of the most improbable air combats of the entire war. As he approached, the German escorts spotted him immediately. Their formation shifted, with the Bf-109s peeling off into 2 pairs, each moving with a predatory confidence that suggested they believed this lone American fighter would pose little threat. Delaney understood the math. 4 Bf-109s could tear his aircraft apart within seconds, especially if he lost engine power mid-maneuver. But he also understood something else. The Bf-109s were not the mission objective. The bombers were. So instead of climbing to meet the fighters, he dove low, dropping beneath the formation until his canopy nearly brushed the tops of hedgerows, using the terrain and the Mustang's slim frontal profile to mask his approach. He bled altitude deliberately, building speed to compensate for the engine's failing output, and then pulled into a shallow climb directly toward the left column of bombers. The German gunners spotted him as he closed the distance. Tracer fire erupted from the Ju-88's nose and ventral guns, bright streaks tearing past his wings, some so close he felt the heat as they whipped through the air. At roughly 300 yards, close enough to see the facial expressions of the defensive gunners, Delaney opened fire. The 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings unleashed a storm of lead, the Mustang shuddering under the recoil as brass casings sprayed behind him like a golden waterfall. His rounds ripped into the first bomber's left engine, which erupted in a violent burst of flame before seizing completely. The aircraft lurched out of formation, trailing black smoke, its crew scrambling to maintain control. Delaney didn't wait to see if it would recover. He pulled under the formation, rolled inverted, and came up beneath the second bomber, sending another precise burst into its bomb bay. The bomber detonated in a blinding explosion midair, debris fanning out across the sky as the shockwave rattled Delaney's Mustang so violently he momentarily lost control, the aircraft dropping nearly 100 feet before he wrestled it back into stable flight. The formation was breaking apart exactly as he'd hoped, panic spreading, cohesion failing, bombardiers losing their bearings. But the Bf-109s were now diving toward him with lethal intent. The cannons opened fire, heavy 20 shells tearing through the air as Delaney banked hard left, then right, then dropped into a steep dive, using every ounce of altitude and speed left to evade their attacks. His engine coughed once, twice, a grim reminder that he was living on borrowed seconds. He climbed again, struggling to gain just enough height to make one more attack pass. His third burst hit the cockpit of another bomber, shattering the glass and sending the aircraft into an immediate uncontrolled descent. But the evasive maneuvers required to survive the escorts, counterattacks drained every last reserve of his engine strength. The Merlin sputtered, rattled, and then died. Within moments, the roar that had been his lifeline fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The propeller continued spinning only from the force of the oncoming wind. His P-51 was no longer a fighter plane, only a glider in hostile skies. Yet even with no power, Delaney refused to surrender. He rolled, dived, side-slipped, and clawed through the air with pure aerodynamic skill, using gravity itself as his ally, or the Bf-109 swarmed around him, firing relentlessly. Tracers whipped past his canopy. A 20 shell tore through his right wing, shredding fabric and sending splinters of metal spiraling into the slipstream. He felt the controls grow heavier, less responsive, the Mustang losing altitude with every turn. Below, the 6 remaining Ju-88s attempted to reform into a functional strike group. But the chaos Delaney had inflicted made it nearly impossible for them to coordinate their positions. Their formations sagged into disarray, each bomber weaving erratically as gunners searched the sky for the Mustang that continued harassing them even without an engine. And then, at the moment when Delaney's glider-like P-51 was nearly within range of German gunfire from the ground, a thunderous roar split the sky. He heard it before he saw it, a deep, rolling growl that meant salvation. 4 American P-47 Thunderbolts descended from the clouds in a steep, devastating dive, their massive airframes shaking the air as they opened fire. Streams of 50-caliber tracers tore through the sky, ripping into the Bf-109s and shredding their formations. One of the German fighters exploded instantly, fragments spiraling downward in a trail of smoke. Another attempted to break away, only to be caught in a hail of bullets that tore off its wing. The remaining 2 fled east, but the Thunderbolts pursued them with unrelenting fury. With the escorts shattered, the P-47s turned their attention to the Ju-88s. The bombers, already damaged and disorganized, stood no chance. American firepower ripped into their engines and fuselages, one after another breaking apart or diving for emergency crash landings. Within minutes, the entire German strike force was eliminated or forced into catastrophic failure. Delaney, gliding powerless toward a long patch of grass bordered by hedgerows, prepared for impact. He lowered his emergency flaps by hand, braced himself, and guided the Mustang into a rough but survivable belly landing. The aircraft slammed into the earth, skidding violently, tearing through grass and dirt before jolting to a stop with a burst of dust and debris. Dazed, bruised, but alive, Delaney clawed his way out of the shattered canopy. The world swayed around him, smoke rising in thin curls, the smell of dirt and burnt metal hanging thick in the air. Yet he had barely taken 3 steps before he heard footsteps crashing through the hedgerow. Lieutenant Mark Thompson appeared, having landed nearby after his own damaged aircraft forced him down. He stared at the wrecked Mustang, then at Delaney, and shook his head in stunned disbelief before saying, "You insane bastard, you actually did it." In the hours that followed, infantrymen secured the area and recovered fragments of German aircraft that had gone down nearby. After-action reports confirmed that the German strike group had been completely neutralized before reaching the beachhead, and analysts later determined that if the bombers had coordinated an attack, they could have inflicted devastating losses on American forces clustered along the beaches and supply lanes. Delaney's extraordinary stand, attacking a superior force with almost no fuel, disabling multiple bombers, scattering the formation, surviving relentless pursuit, and holding the line alone until reinforcements arrived, became the subject of intense study among pilots and commanders. Official recommendations initially called for the Distinguished Service Cross, but this was later downgraded to the Silver Star, though his peers argued for years that the downgrade failed to capture the sheer magnitude of his actions. Mechanics who inspected the wreck of his P-51 calculated that Delaney had kept the aircraft airborne for several minutes after complete fuel starvation, a feat considered nearly impossible given the demands of high-stress combat maneuvers. His battered aircraft was dismantled for parts, but the wing that absorbed direct cannon hits was shipped to England and displayed temporarily as a testament to pilot bravery and machine endurance. Delaney returned to flying within weeks, continuing combat operations across France and Germany, yet he rarely spoke of the incident except to express gratitude toward the P-47 pilots who had arrived just in time. Still, every man who heard the story understood the truth. For that desperate stretch of combat, Delaney alone had stood between 9 lethal bombers and thousands of exposed Allied soldiers. In the chaos and brutality of war, where survival often depended on numbers, equipment, and luck, he demonstrated something that could not be taught: a refusal to surrender, a willingness to face the impossible, and a courage that transformed a powerless fighter plane into a final shield between enemy bombers and the men on the ground. His story, largely forgotten outside military archives, remains one of the most extraordinary episodes of aerial bravery in the Second World War, a reminder of how a single pilot, with nothing but a failing engine, a dying aircraft, and an unbreakable will, held the line long enough for help to arrive, and ensured that an entire sector of the Normandy invasion survived to fight another day.